Imagine a world where the books we now hold as sacred were just loosely connected texts, floating in a sea of uncertainty and debate. In the early centuries of Christianity, the New Testament as we know it today was not a fixed collection of authoritative writings. Instead, it was a collection of texts that were gradually elevated to the status of Scripture, a process that took several hundred years and involved numerous debates, harmonizations, and innovations. This video explores the transformation of the New Testament from a collection of important texts into the sacred Scripture that it is today, focusing on the 2nd century as a pivotal period in this journey. In the early days of Christianity, the Gospels, letters, and other writings that would eventually form the New Testament were not seen as fixed, unchangeable documents. Instead, they were viewed as sources of information and inspiration, much like the historical and biographical works of the Greco-Roman world. These texts were read, studied, and even modified by early Christian communities. The fluid nature of these texts is evident in the work of Tatian, a Christian apologist who lived around 100 to 180 CE. Tatian created the Diatessaron, a harmonized version of the 4 Gospels, which aimed to resolve discrepancies and create a single, coherent narrative of Jesus' life. This work was so successful that it was widely used in Syria for 2 centuries, demonstrating that the Gospels were considered significant, but not yet sacrosanct. Tatian's ability to blend and modify the Gospels suggests that they were still seen as repositories of stories and sayings that could be reorganized and adapted to meet the needs of the community. The concept of the Gospels as fixed, unchangeable texts began to take shape later in the 2nd century. Origen, a prominent Christian scholar who lived in the 3rd century, wrote commentaries on the Gospels as separate works, treating them as authoritative and immutable. This shift in perception is also reflected in the practice of nomina sacra, or holy names, which emerged in the 2nd century. In early Christian manuscripts, certain words such as Jesus, Christ, God, and Spirit were often abbreviated or contracted, a practice that marked these texts as special and sacred. This tradition, which is similar to the modern practice of capitalizing holy terms, indicates that the texts were beginning to be treated with reverence and were seen as more than just historical accounts. By the time of Augustine, who lived in the 4th century, the Gospels were firmly established as canonical scripture. Augustine's work on the consensus of the evangelists, De Consensu Evangelistarum, is a detailed attempt to show that the Gospels are consistent with each other and that any apparent discrepancies are merely superficial. This reflects a belief that the Gospels are divinely inspired and should not be altered. The transition from fluid sources to fixed scripture is also evident in the development of the codex, a book format that became the standard for Christian texts. The codex allowed for easier reading and referencing, and it helped to standardize the collection of texts that would eventually become the New Testament. The 2nd century was a crucial period in the development of the New Testament. During this time, the texts began to be treated with increasing reverence and were gradually elevated to the status of Scripture. However, this process was not uniform or uncontested. Different Christian communities had varying collections of texts, and there was ongoing debate about which writings should be considered authoritative. The creation of harmonized versions like the Diatessaron and the use of nomina sacra are just two examples of how early Christians sought to make sense of the diverse and sometimes conflicting texts they inherited. The transition of the New Testament from a collection of important texts to a fixed, authoritative scripture was a gradual and complex process. It involved the work of early Christian scholars, the development of new practices, and the growing recognition of the text's spiritual and theological significance. By the end of the 2nd century, many of the books that would eventually form the New Testament were already highly respected and widely used. But it was not until the 4th century that the canon was officially defined, and the boundaries of the New Testament were firmly established. In conclusion, the New Testament's journey from a collection of texts to the sacred scripture we know today is a testament to the dynamic and evolving nature of early Christianity. This process reflects the complex interplay of tradition, innovation, and community consensus that shaped the religion's foundational texts.